Neat. All right, so we'll get started, but feel free to keep typing in where you're joining us from. It's kind of interesting to learn. Welcome, everybody. I'm Matt Molina. I'm the director of NYC H2O, and I'm super excited to be joined tonight by Erica Gies, award-winning journalist and author of the book Water Always Wins. And she is also a National Geographic Explorer. And I hope that Erica will tell us what that means, because I think it's relative to relevant to the book. And but for those of you who are new to H2O, I just want to tell you a little bit about it, and then I'll formally introduce Erica. H2O is a nonprofit environmental education organization, and we do a lot of field trips for schools where we bring kids outside to natural areas in New York City, lakes and old reservoirs and beaches and wetlands, to teach about water and the New York City water system and water ecology. We're blessed in New York City with an incredible water system. Our water is pretty much unfiltered because nature does that filtering for us. It comes from forests upstate. And so we recognize that, and we appreciate that. And so we teach our students that nature takes care of us, so we have to take care of nature. And that's part of the reason that we're presenting Erica and her book tonight, because she talks about how we need to take care of our planet. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Erica Gies, author of Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge. Erica is an award-winning journalist and National Geographic Explorer. She writes about water, climate change, plants, and critters for such journals as Scientific American, Nature, New York Times, The Atlantic, Guardian, The Economist, and other publications. So welcome, Erica. It's so great to have you. Excited for your talk. Please.
Thank you, Matt. I'm so happy to be here. And I think you're right that we share a lot of common ideas in our approach to water. So I just want to make sure everybody can see my screen now.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is the cover of my book. The North America edition is the one with the fish, and the other one is the UK edition. And basically, it is a look at how we need to change our relationship with water if we want to avoid the increasing floods and droughts that we're beginning to see more and more often. And basically, it's about, rather than trying to control water, instead looking to collaborate with water to understand what water needs, and to make space for it within our human habitats, both city and rural. So, we hear a lot about climate change as water change, that the reason why we're having all of this increase in flooding and drought is because of climate change. And that is definitely part of it. As the air warms, for every 1 degree Celsius increase globally, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water vapor. And water vapor is also a greenhouse gas, so that tends to aggravate the cycle of warming. So in the United States, water, because there's more water in the atmosphere, the water that falls during a heavy rainstorm has increased since the late 1950s. And the Northeast has seen that particularly acutely, with an increase of 55%. But even in the Southwest, which we tend to think of as very drought prone, and indeed it is, still when it's getting storms, they tend to have 10% more water in those storms. And water, the warming air also exacerbates drought and drying because it pulls more water out of soil and plants, dries out the land. 2 billion people around the world are already living with water insecurity, and that's expected to soon affect 2/3 of the global population. Another reason for the heavy flooding that we're seeing is because storms are traveling more slowly, 10% more slowly than they did in the mid 20th century. So, that's why Hurricane Harvey stalling out over Houston dumped so much water, or Dorian over the Bahamas. And another phenomenon that we're seeing with increased sea level rise is coastal flooding, even during sunny days. So that's called sunny day flooding or king tide flooding. And since 2000, the frequency of those days when it floods and there's no storm has increased by 5 times in some US cities. So climate change is having a big impact on the water cycle, and we're seeing it in all these ways. However, it's not just climate change that is causing these water problems, and a lot of the narrative that we're seeing around it is tending to blame it all on climate change. But in fact, our development choices have a big impact on the flooding and the water scarcity that we're seeing. I call this the control of water. It's kind of a nod to John McPhee's The Control of Nature. But in our building of cities and industrial agriculture, we have made dramatic changes to the water cycle. We have filled or drained 87% of the world's wetlands, and often either plowed farm fields on top of it or built apartment buildings. We've intervened with dams and other infrastructure on 2/3 of the world's major rivers. We've altered 75% of the world's land area. And just since 1992, the surface area of our cities with all of the pavement and asphalt has doubled. So that is double the area where water cannot soak into the land. During kind of a similar earlier timeline, like from the mid 70s to today, the world population has doubled from 4 billion people to 8 billion. And as we've been using all this land area, the population size of wild animals has decreased dramatically by 2/3. And you may wonder, why am I bringing animals into this? But in fact, the kinds of water solutions that I'm talking about in this book are closely tied to natural systems, which involves plants, microbes, beavers, all kinds of animals and humans. And so these projects can also help restore space for biodiversity. So the people in my book, I call them water detectives because they are asking a fairly radical question for our current society, which is, what does water want? And we tend to think of water as either a commodity or as a threat. So something to control in either case. But that has led to us typically erasing a lot of water's slow phases. We tend to speed it up and move it off the land. And so, we see that with levees where we're channeling rivers, and certainly in our city stormwater systems where, the water that can't soak into the land then starts flooding. And so then we want to rush it out of the city as quickly as possible. So basically, what water wants, the water detectives has found, is to reclaim many of its slow phases. So in my book, I call that a slow water ethic or a slow water manifesto. So natural places where slow water happens are wetlands, floodplains, water towers, which are basically the tops of mountains that could be grasslands or could be forested, but they tend to be the source of a lot of water that many people around the world use. And the term slow water has parallels to the slow food movement that arose in Italy in the late 20th century, in that it is meant to draw people's attention to where water comes from and how its management affects people and the environment. It's also in the spirit of many indigenous traditions who, rather than seeing water as a commodity or a threat, view water as a relative, an entity with its own agency, its own relationships, and something that we need to take care of if it is also going to take care of us. It's a reciprocal relationship. The similar ideas were espoused by the 20th century conservationist Aldo Leopold with his land ethic and his son Luna Leopold's river ethic. So the question comes, what does this look like in real life? What is a slow water project? How do you collaborate with water instead of seek to control it? So there are some characteristics. First is treating water with respect and trying to understand what it wants. And a lot of times that involves looking at what it did historically, so we can understand that, oh, that apartment building is flooding regularly because we built it on wetland and the water still wants to go there. But these projects are also, they're based around a systems theory, which is the idea of all of the elements that water has a relationship with, from microbes to beavers to plants, etc., the soil, the rock. So it's not necessarily like a linear solution, which is kind of the approach that we've taken with levees and dams, but it's looking for how we can recreate to the extent possible the elements that water had originally in that particular area. So that means that every slow water project is unique to its place, to its geology, ecology, its local population. So there are some common ideas or approaches, but every place is different. And so every people in every place, need to explore what water wants in that area to understand what the best solution might be. So slow water is ideally local water. Of course, we have a lot of water that's not local, particularly in a place like California, where I'm from. Much water comes from elsewhere. But that can create a lot of problems, certainly for the environment, but also for other people. Interventions such as dams on large rivers over the last 40 years or so have brought more water to 20% of people, but deprived 24% of people of that water. So there's no kind of magic water. It has to come from somewhere. And these slow water projects are typically decentralized. And so it's kind of similar to the way that solar panels on every roof add up to a lot of energy. When you think about all of the places that water used to linger on land, we've occupied a lot of that. And so sometimes when people are talking about nature-based solutions, they think, well, it can't be a significant part of the solution because this 1,000 feet of creek that we daylighted can't soak up all the water from our city that occupies hundreds of square miles. But it's a watershed. The water moves throughout the landscape, and so you need places throughout for the water to linger and to interact with the underground. And so that's definitely different than the way we have been doing things. We've had this very centralized water management approach. And so that tends to be a big project like a reservoir that can be fenced off and protected from people. But these kinds of decentralized projects often, because they're spread across the landscape, people come into contact with them more. And so there's an element of community responsibility and caretaking that can be involved, which can actually be a really positive thing because people understand more where their water comes from and what it needs. So slow water projects also interact a lot with the underground. So more than 97% of all liquid fresh water on the planet is underground. It's a very significant part of the water system. And in a place like California, you know, we've tended to think of groundwater as extra water that we pump when we have a drought. But in fact, as you can see in this diagram, you know, the groundwater and the surface water are linked. They're part of the same system. So when you deplete surface water, groundwater, if there's enough, can come fill it up from below. When the groundwater is depleted, surface water can decline into the ground to refill that. So, you know, you can be actually depleting your surface water that was already scarce when you're pumping groundwater. So one sign that New Yorkers probably noticed in terms of the groundwater surface water interaction came during Superstorm Sandy, when lower Manhattan actually flooded from below before water came across. You know, you think when you have a big storm or hurricane that you're going to have waves crashing over, and that did eventually happen. But rising water in the ocean from the storm surge, the East River's flow, plus a high tide, all put pressure on groundwater, which pushed it up through the subway system and into buildings' interconnected stormwater and sewer drains. And so, you know, water can be very unpredictable in these ways. It can act in ways we don't expect. And it's because we're often ignoring what happens underground. So you may be familiar with this photo or this map, sorry. It's from the New York Emergency Management. And it is a picture of neighborhoods that were affected by, sorry, I'm forgetting the name. The big storm that you had, Ida, sorry, the storm Ida. So sea level rise is one part of the situation. And, you know, on the lower part of Manhattan, there has been 9 inches of sea level rise since 1950, which raises the risk both of the sunny day flooding and the storm surges. But that rate is accelerating. So the last 6 inches of rise happened in less than 50 years. And the Army Corps projects that the next 6 inches will happen in just 14 years. So New York has considered giant seawalls. It may still be considering giant seawalls, such as the 6-mile barrier that would shut off New York Harbor. And there are environmental concerns in terms of, you know, water not being able to flush through the system and pollution building up. But also, you know, it just won't work. And partly that's because it's not planned to go high enough for how high sea level rise is expected to be by the time it's done being built. But also, you know, what we saw with Ida is a lot of water also comes from the sky. And so the rate of precipitation that happened up to more than 3 inches in 1 hour exceeded the capacity of the infrastructure to get that water out of the city. And so, you know, if you have a flood barrier across the harbor, that's not going to help in a situation like Ida, which I'm sure you are all very aware of. So I'm going to now describe some things that other places are trying to kind of give some ideas of approaches that may or may not work in New York. I mean, it all depends on, you know, every place being specific, but these are some ideas that people are doing elsewhere. First up, this is Chennai, India, formerly known as Madras, on the southeast coast of the subcontinent. And Chennai was big in the headlines a couple of years ago because it ran out of water. It was actually not a big surprise to people who live in Chennai because they run out of water almost every summer. And some people never have water. A lot of people are not even connected to water. They also have big flooding issues. And there was a big flood in 2015 that killed more than 400 people and was quite a shock to the city that kind of caused people to sit up and realize, okay, we have to do something different. And a really interesting thing about Chennai is although it runs out of water regularly, it actually receives 1.5 times the amount of water that it uses in its monsoon period. So it receives that water and then it rushes it out of the city. And then later during the dry season, it pumps water from underground. It's building desalination plants. So it's basically wasting the water that it gets, and then it's running out of water later. So these are two sides of the same problem, and we're beginning to see this more and more in urban areas around the world, such as Mexico City. And a lot of it has to do with all of the pavement in urban areas and our approach to dealing with that, which has been to rush that water out of the city. Chennai is seeing these problems more often today because it's gone from about 19 square miles in 1980 to more than 165 square miles today. And it was built on a very water-rich area. It has rivers, backwaters, coastal estuaries, mangrove forests, human-built lakes, and as more and more of that area has been filled in and occupied by buildings, there's been less and less space for that water to go. So it's very similar to New York in that way, which is also built largely on wetlands. This picture on the left here is called Palikaranai Marsh. And since the 1980s, it is now 1/10 the size it was. It's been filled in. They've built a big IT center there, not dissimilar from what happened in the San Francisco Bay Area, where Google and Facebook sit on filled-in marsh. And then this picture over here is a water tank. A lot of people in Chennai and other cities around the world receive their water by water tank. And this is a jewel beetle that lives in Palikaranai Marsh. So what people in Chennai are doing to try to solve these dueling water problems is first stop building on marsh and other wetlands. In some cases, they are reclaiming and restoring areas that are flooding and being damaged and making more room on the banks of rivers where there has been encroachment. But one of the really unique things that they're doing is the people who live in Chennai are Tamil, and their culture goes back thousands of years in this area. And they had an ancient system of managing water called Eris, that's spelled E-R-I-S. And basically from the mountains all the way down to the water, the ocean, they had a series of tanks that were built, ponds basically. And the word Eri means tank in Tamil. And so some of these were attached to a river or a creek, and some of them were in dry areas, but attached to each other. And basically, like on a mountain, you would build the pond, and then there would be a little divot on the low side. And when it would fill, then it would run over to the next one. So you had this kind of stepped series of ponds going all the way down. And when the British arrived, there were an estimated 53,000 of these from the mountains, the Eastern Ghats, down to the Bay of Bengal. And this wasn't just like an irrigation system, it was actually inserting humans into the natural hydrology, because they were also providing the rivers their due along the way and the wetlands. And interestingly, like at this point in time, people don't actually know, like the words lake, tank, water body are interchangeable because people don't remember if something was human built or nature built. And when the British came, they largely destroyed the system. There are some remnants of it remaining. And now people are working to restore that also, to give water a path to flow throughout the city and the landscape, including tied into the marshes and the other natural areas. So one thing that has been kept within the city is this. It's called a temple tank. And you can see this is in Mylapore, which is a neighborhood in Chennai. And this is the Kapalishwar temple. And this is its tank. So every temple had its own tank. It was sort of the center of village life. And this tank historically would have been connected to all the other tanks across the landscape. And the water level in the tank would also show people water availability. Since it was tied to the groundwater table, they could look at it and know, when there was time to plant, enough water to plant, etc. So because religion is important, these tanks have survived within the city, even as the city has been built. So that's one option within the city for a place to hold and recharge water. This one, unfortunately, cannot recharge water because it's been paved on the bottom. As water got scarce, they wanted to make sure that there was water there for religious purposes, so they paved it, and it's no longer porous. But hopefully, they're trying to basically undo that. And right across the street, here's a really old temple tank that's about 2,000 years old, and it's not been paved. So you can see this is the true sign of the water level. At that point, it was about 60 feet below ground. So people in the city are trying to reconnect water pathways to the temple tanks to use them as storage facilities, and also create a patchwork of small bits of permeable land throughout the city. So that might be in a schoolyard or in somebody's backyard, or a hotel's landscaping. And also open land isn't necessarily permeable land. It depends on the soil and how much clay or sand there is. So sometimes that needs to be reworked if you're really looking to use it as a place to move water into the underground. So I'm going to shift to San Francisco Bay now, which is where I'm from. And I bring this example to you because, like New York, the San Francisco Bay Area is coastal and, has also eradicated a lot of its natural marshlands. At one point, the San Francisco Bay had lost perhaps 90% of its historic marshes. I think New York's figure is about 85%, so we're neck and neck there. And tidal marshes and other coastal ecosystems can be really great at protecting coastal areas from flooding in big storms. Also mangroves, eelgrass beds, coral and shellfish reefs. When it comes to tidal marshes, they can actually grow with sea level rise. So there's sediment, and the sediment sort of is carried in the water, sits down upon the marsh. The plants grow up through the sediment. They die. They also contribute to the sediment. And in that way, it can keep pace with sea level rise, we think. We don't know if it can grow as fast as sea levels are rising right now because we've never seen that. But there have been examples, including in San Francisco Bay, of places keeping up with the sea level rise that we've seen so far. So in San Francisco Bay, there was a lot of tidal mudflats, which seemed like great places that could be real estate if we just put a little more dirt on them and filled them in. During the gold rush, a lot of ships came to shore and then people abandoned them to go to the gold fields, and eventually those sank in the mud, and eventually people put dirt on top of them. And there are a lot of buildings in downtown San Francisco that actually have ships in the basement. But in the 1950s, the Army Corps of Engineers had a plan to fill in 2/3 of the remaining bay. And a group of women conservationists said, you know, that's it, it's gone too far. So they started fighting it, and that was the beginning of the bay restoration, the tidal marsh restoration projects in the bay. So these are among the oldest and the largest marsh restoration projects in the United States, I think second only to the Everglades. And so far, about 28% of the historic marshes have been restored. I should say 18%, the 10% that weren't restored, plus an additional 18%. Another 12% have already, had the land secured and they're getting ready to restore them. In order for this to work, there needs to be time, space. So marshes, part of the way they rise is kind of by migrating inland. So if you have buildings right there, then the marsh doesn't have anywhere to go and it can't grow in this way. And it also needs sediment. And sediment is basically, dirt and sand that's floating in the water. And that can come both from the sea, tidal sediment, and also upland. So that's from rivers and streams. And of course, all of those things have been heavily engineered. So we have a real sediment scarcity problem right now. But I just want to kind of, that's a long story in and of itself. But I just want to emphasize that these connections between ecosystems are really important. So it's not just the marsh that you have to restore. You have to think of the whole, series of natural connections. So I'll get into that in a minute. San Francisco Bay had a big salt industry at one point. You can see the salt pond on the right of this picture. Basically, people would build a little levee, dry out the seawater, collect the salt, let in some more seawater, repeat. The salt industry has largely moved elsewhere. And so that's been an opportunity to restore some of these marshes. You can see the beginnings of the restoration over here on the left. And so there's been a lot of opportunity in that way to reclaim some of these marshes. But there are other things that people can do in really built up cities. We tend to think of cities as really static, but in fact, a lot of building stock does turn over. And if you, as a community, can do some historical ecology research to find out, where the wetlands and streams were, and I know a lot of that has been done in New York, then you can plan on a city level for, okay, if that building is removed, then maybe we want to buy that land and keep it for water in some way. And there can also be kind of targeted conservation. So I did a story for Scientific American about a stream in Seattle, and they only did, I think, about 1,400 feet of stream in 2 different places. But because they had chosen natural floodplains, they've actually relieved a lot of the flooding in those areas. So, you can kind of plan it strategically. And then I just wanted to show you this picture, which is of an historical marsh. So this marsh on the left, you can see it's sort of all even, and there's some, water pathways through it, but it looks kind of the same. Whereas this one has a lot of different colors. And that's because there are so many different levels of the way, the sediment has accreted. So slightly different elevations that grow different plants. And this kind of diversity is really important for wildlife, but it's also important as a protection for human habitats, because the more complex a system is like this, the better it buffers, and the healthier it is, and the more it can grow. Sorry, I clicked, there we go. So let's see. Oh, I just want to also add that these slow water projects, aside from the biodiversity impact or opportunity, which can bring a lot of diverse critters back into our close landscape by restoring some of the systems on which they depend, systems that we have erased. These projects are also often not just climate adaptation, making our communities more resilient to both flooding and drought, because these areas act as buffers, but they can also be climate mitigation. They can actually reduce emissions. We hear a lot about tree planting, which can be good if it's done right. There's a lot of nuance to that, but marshlands, peatlands, grasslands, a lot of these water systems are super stores of carbon. And also, that depends on whether it's drying out and other factors. But there was an interesting study that showed that marshes can actually increase their carbon storage as sea levels rise if they don't drown too quickly. So they looked at 345 wetland sites on 6 continents over a 6,000-year period. And they found that when faced with sea level rise, coastal wetlands can store 2 to 9 times more carbon dioxide in their soils. So these kinds of slow water projects can help prevent flood, help prevent drought, act as important habitat for biodiversity, and increasingly we're seeing international commitments to making space for other living beings. And they can also help to store carbon. So they're really, and they can also clean water, which is a whole nother topic. But when you compare that with, a single purpose solution like building a levee or a seawall, that actually creates a lot of environmental damage, and also an ecological justice issue, because one area can afford that seawall, but then that's actually moving extra water energy onto their neighbors who maybe can't afford the seawall. So giving water space can provide many of these kind of joint benefits. And I just want to leave you with a few ideas, which is, first of all, stop building on marshes. That sounds really obvious, but people continue to build on marshes. People continue to build right at sea level. In New York, many of you are probably familiar. There's an area in Red Hook that is being built right now on marshes that flooded 10 feet deep during Sandy. There's building happening in Williamsburg, Greenpoint, Long Island City, Hallett's Point, all in places that were submerged during Sandy. There are natural solutions that are happening in places around New York. So far, they're kind of small for the scale that's needed, but there's some exciting projects. You've probably heard of many of them. One of is Living Breakwaters by the New York landscape firm Scape. They're building an oyster reef habitat around the south end of Staten Island. The Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge has been converting some of its plants to more salt tolerant plants so that it can survive and thrive as it becomes inundated more often. The Patargat Basin Natural Area in Canarsie, that was a dump, and now it's been restored into more of a natural marshland coastal ecosystem. I believe that there are some with NYC H2O as well, like the Reservoir Project. What is that one called? The blueways that are happening in Staten Island as well.
Correct, Blue Belt. Yep.
Blue Belt, thank you. Yeah, I have it right here. Ridgewood Reservoir. Anyway, so those projects are great, and ideally there would be many more of them, which would give water more access to more of its historical areas. I believe you've had Eric Sanderson talk to you before, and you know, he's quite an expert in what water was doing in New York historically. And you know, he said in a recent New York Times op-ed that we're going to have to move back from some areas, and that is definitely true. You know, some of the places where we are occupying, we're not going to be able to hold back water for too much longer. And some people on Staten Island recognize that after Sandy. You know, there was some quote unquote managed retreat from Oakwood Beach, Grand Beach, Ocean Breeze. Homeowners there took buyouts and moved to inland areas, and that those places were returned to marsh. There are also some new developments happening in nearby areas, so it's not a total win. But there has been increasing talk about retreat and how to do that in a way that's equitable, that doesn't put people into crisis. So if you can plan for it before the disaster strikes, then you know, you have an opportunity to think about it and to move towards something better. And in my book, there are examples from the Midwest towns that flooded a lot and decided to move all together. The whole town moved together. Something like that isn't so possible in a place like New York City, but there are opportunities that are unique to different places. And so at a time when we're faced with having to make these tough decisions, the idea of building new stuff in harm's way is kind of mind-blowing, but it's still happening. And then one other thing I talk about in my book, which I'll just touch on briefly so we have time for questions, is amphibious housing. And this is a pretty new concept and hasn't been built in a lot of places, and there are various policy issues with doing so, or blocks right now that need to be overcome. But the idea is the house is attached to kind of a pole, so it can rise as the water rises and then fall as the water falls. So the water actually lifts the house out of danger and keeps it safe. Designs so far don't really work, you know, in the face of a hurricane. This is more a solution for a marshy area. But anyway, something to think about for the future. And so I would say that all of the projects in my book, the basic overarching attitude that needs to change within us is thinking about what water wants and how can we accommodate water and work with water, because there are so many benefits to us if we work with water rather than try to fight it. And the way that we've been fighting it, the reason it's no longer working is partly because of our immense population growth and partly because of climate change. So even though they've kind of worked for some period of time, they're failing more and more often. So we do need to do something different. But what I find really exciting about these slow water projects is that, you know, climate change can feel really overwhelming. The thought of the world having to reduce emissions, and are other countries going to reduce emissions? Is our country going to reduce emissions? But slow water projects are something that you can do in your own community and watershed, working with your neighbors, both to help mitigate climate change and to help make your community more resilient. So my book is an invitation to get more curious about water and to change our attitude to one of collaboration. And you can find out more about that at my website for the book, which is slowwater.world. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. That was really fascinating. I learned so much. Before I get to my questions, and we invite everyone to ask their questions. You can come off of mute or put them in the chat. I just want to let everyone know I put a link to Erica's book in the chat, and I strongly encourage you to get it. Fascinating. I do want to mention Oakwood Beach is a fascinating place to visit. It, as you said, was an area where they did do the managed retreat, and it's kind of surreal. But that is one of our sites that we help steward and clean the beach there. And it really is a a beautiful area, and we see all kinds of wildlife there. So it's not an area of New York City that most people know about. So I'm glad that you spoke about it. I found it really interesting. I had heard it before, but I had forgotten it, that that marshes can rise with sea level, and it just goes to show you just how amazing nature is, and how we really do need to practice these slow water methods and give space for the wetlands. That picture that you showed of the wetlands in the Bay Area is stunning, and I'm fortunate that I've gotten to visit some of them. Yeah, and some of them are run by National Park Service. I think even that they're part of a wildlife refuge, and just the number of shorebirds was just really breathtaking to see the diversity in the shorebirds, and and our marsh areas, like you said, in Jamaica Bay are stunning too. And our partners, the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Park Conservancy, facilitated a large marsh restoration, planting over 200,000 little. Let me take myself off of.
Shall I stop sharing my screen?
No, I wouldn't, because people might ask questions about it. But just to finish the thought, little plugs, 200,000 salt grasses plugs that that Erica had mentioned. So we are doing it, here in the city, not at the scale that we ought to be, but it certainly is something that we are doing. The one other thing I wanted to mention, and then I encourage people to start, formulating their questions and putting them in the chat, or getting ready to ask them live on your camera, is there's a neighborhood in Queens, and the southeastern section of Queens, where they experience the homes that were built along the old stream beds consistently experience flooding during rain events, because of the way the groundwater wants to flow, and because in decades past, we actually used to pump the groundwater to use it and to supplement our tap water, but we don't do that anymore. So the ground level, the groundwater levels, the water table has risen. So between the combination of that and building on top of the stream beds, many people have report flooding in their basements. And when the city maps those flooding reports, they basically follow the path of the old stream beds.
Yeah.
So that
I hear that from people in cities all over the world who have streams popping up in their basements, because humans like to settle by rivers and creeks. They needed water, but then once they became sort of garbage pits and sewage dumps, they wanted to get rid of them, so filled them in, buried them, and also to make more real estate for cities. So it's very, very common for cities to have 70% or more of their creeks buried underground.
Yeah. And I thought your point, and again, I invite the audience to start, put to please type your questions in the chat, or formulating them in your head and getting ready to ask them live. I just wanted to uh, to thank you for making the point that the seawalls don't work, if you have all this rain, like in Ida, dumping, so intensely from above. I wasn't aware of the that statistics, that data you had quoted. Was it 3 inches an hour, 3.25 inches of rain in the hour?
Yeah, I think that was the high point.
1.5, yeah.
3.15 inches came in an hour, and the sewer capacity is like 1.5 to 2 inches max. So that was definitely part of the problem.
Yeah, no,
And also, when you have a creek, aside from the sewer, some of the water is flowing through creeks underground, but when it's enclosed in a pipe, it has a very finite amount of space. So if the water exceeds that capacity, then you also have a problem.
Yeah, and thank you also for pointing out this map. We were not aware of it, and so we actually have some work to do with this. So thank you for that.
Cool.
Okay, I've been talking a lot. As you could see, I'm pretty motivated by Erica's talk. So I invite everybody, please ask your questions. Come off of the chat. Let us know what you think. Okay. Well, I do have another question. What are some of the projects that you're working on now?
Well, I just published a story yesterday that is about decolonizing conservation. So that was for Hackeye magazine, which is based in Victoria. It covers coastal issues around the world. And several Indigenous researchers wrote a paper, and they are talking about like the Western conservation model, which tends to be, again, kind of linear, focused on a single species and focused on human needs and, how many of the species can we kill without making it go extinct? Whereas, the Indigenous approach tends to be much more holistic and systems oriented. So anyway, they have several points in this paper, and it was basically a story about that paper. And I'm working on another story, which is also about Indigenous issues. A group on coastal BC has declared its own Indigenous protected area, which again, like involves not just the marine area, but also the land up to the mountain, which is, counter to our management. So, a federal agency governs marine issues here, and the province governs logging and watersheds. So it's partly about managing it holistically, and then it's also partly kind of a, I won't call it a power struggle, but these Indigenous groups haven't signed any treaties, they haven't relinquished their land, and so they are distraught at what's been done to it, and they're trying to reclaim governance of it so that they can manage it in the way that they see fit. So it's a pretty interesting case study.
Yeah, it's always a challenge when you have different bureaucracies battling over control of land. We have that here, just in the city. You have the federal government owns some land, and the city government owns some land right right on the beach, and right at the border, they don't know whose responsibility it is to take care of what. So that that border area doesn't get much love.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, it's definitely a problem. One of the stories in my book is about California's agricultural industry and, water scarcity, and helping to sort of recreate to some extent the historic flooding of the Central Valley that used to recharge groundwater, by discovering this geologic feature called paleo valleys. And it's kind of a long story, but they discovered one near Sacramento. And the researcher, there's also extra irrigation water right there. So the researcher wants to try to use that to refill the groundwater using the Paleo Valley. But the city already wants to build a development there, but there's a little strip of federally owned land right next to this canal. And so, they're trying to see whether they can squeeze it in there to kind of just show proof of concept almost. But yeah, it can be really tricky. One of the things about the sea level rise or the marsh restoration work in the Bay Area that is really notable is I think there's more than 200 governments around the Bay Area when you're looking at different cities, and there's 9 counties and the state. And the reason that their marsh restoration has been so successful is they do kind of have an amazing history of these many entities, governments, as well as scientists working together toward this goal of marsh restoration over 20 or 30 years now. So that's kind of a case study in itself if you're wondering about how to make it work from a governance perspective.
that's interesting to hear, and that actually one of our audience members asks, actually my colleague Kevin asks, man, and I'm reading from the chat, manage retreat seems like one of the more challenging needs, and especially challenging in democratic countries. So I'm curious, outside of Staten Island, where you're finding hope. And it sounds like in the Bay Area, it's been a success story. And from what I've seen, the couple of times that I've visited, uh, it's pretty remarkable to see some of the restoration. But perhaps you've seen it elsewhere also.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin's right. It is very tricky. The places that I feature in my book, like Staten Island, like the towns in the Midwest, they chose to leave democratically. They proactively wanted to leave. And I think that that can happen to communities when they flood repeatedly. There can be a point where they just get tired of cleaning up and trying to rebuild in place. And so they are attracted to moving and buyout opportunities if that can work from a financial perspective. The Union of Concerned Scientists tried to cost out, what would it take to buy out all the properties that are, at flood risk over the next, I don't remember, so don't quote me on this, 30 or 50 years or something. And it was, 1 point something trillion, which sounds like a lot of money, but, that's how much we spent on some of this Recovery Act stuff. So, it's kind of a question of political will. If we really do want to help people move back from harm and, move to something better, something more equitable, we can do that. I realize that's not an exact answer, but I think there is hope, and ideally, some of the planning that's happening now and some of the mapping, like where we see where things are, waters rising. Hopefully, as more and more people do suffer and move the hard way, more people will opt to move the easy way, before something bad happens.
Right. Makes sense. It's interesting to hear that Union of Concerned Scientists actually carried out that exercise to price out how much would it cost to buy out all the homes in harm's way or in flood areas. It makes sense. And when you talk about it in those terms, $1 trillion seems like a wise investment, especially when you
Right.
think about, someone like Bill Gates has almost $1 trillion himself. And,
Yeah. And I mean, we don't often talk about opportunity costs when it comes to climate change. There's so much talk about, oh, we can't possibly afford to get off fossil fuels or to change our energy infrastructure, et cetera. But, people aren't looking at the cost of all of the disasters and all of the rebuilding after the disasters, and, compensating people for all kinds of losses and lost work, et cetera. So if you compare it against that, in fact, investing now in these changes is going to save us a lot of money in the long run.
yes. So Katie asks a good question. It's not an easy answer. And it's also a local question to New York City. And if we can't answer it to Katie's satisfaction, we can continue the conversation. Katie asks first and says, "Great talk, thank you. Why is New York City allowing development along the waterfront in Greenpoint, Williamsburg, Long Island City that have recently flooded?"
Unfortunately, this phenomenon is not unique to New York. This happens in the Bay Area. This happens everywhere, it seems. And, part of it is the way the incentive structures are designed. Cities get property tax from development, and, an apartment building is going to pay more tax than a marsh. And so, the developer who probably is going to sell it and not be connected to it long term, they make their money, they leave. The city is getting an increased tax base. There's certainly social pressures. Of course, housing pricing and scarcity is an issue in many, many places around the world. So, there can be a lot of political pressure to build more housing. But again, it's sort of like a short-term, long-term perspective problem, because the city is signing up to provide services to this new development, to protect it from flooding, to provide it with water, electricity, sewer treatment. And as sea level rises, as things are flooding more frequently, that's going to become more and more expensive. So, they may be increasing their tax base in the short term, but ultimately they're going to be on the hook for increasingly increasing costs going forward, and also probably social and political costs, as disasters happen and people die and people start questioning, why did the city allow this building in the first place? So it's a real problem. I think humans can be really prone to short-term thinking, and this is an example of that.
Yeah, it's a good answer. Well, Erica, thank you so much. I learned so much, fascinating. So, and I hope we can continue the conversation. And I look forward to reading the article that you just put out about decolonizing conservation. I think it's important. I think there in general needs to be more diversity when it comes to these discussions. And so thanks again. It really was an enlightening talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Sorry, let me do this. Yeah, it was such a pleasure to be here, and it was great to talk to this group. And yeah, I love all the projects that you're working on there. I'm just putting in the chat a link to the Scientific American article that I mentioned, because
Thank you.
it's about restoring an urban stream and a part of the stream that helps the system function called the hyporheic zone. So I feel like this audience would particularly like this story, and hopefully might get some inspiration from it as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, I got it. Okay, perfect.
Okay,
Thanks for pointing this out. What did you
sure.
call the surrounding area? Hyper what zone?
It's hyporheic. It's Hyporheic, and it's from Greek and it means underflow. So basically, under a river and a creek, there is a very slow moving creek. And this is not groundwater, and it's not the surface stream. It's an ecotone, which is an in-between zone. And many, many important things happen there in terms of biological and chemical processing and the whole base of the food web and the systems within the waterway.
Okay,
So yeah, for urban restoration, it's really important.
thank you. That's beautiful. You may have heard that the city, after decades of working to make possible their getting closer and closer to daylighting the Tibbetts Brook, which runs from Westchester down into the city in the Bronx through Van Cortlandt Park. And then as it exits Van Cortlandt Park, unfortunately now it goes into a sewer, but hopefully that will change. And they have the channel laid out for it, and they have some properties that still need to be purchased, mainly from the rail company called CSX. It's a freight rail company, but they have a spur that is not being used. So Senator Chuck Schumer was instrumental in helping purchase it, and it's not a done deal yet, but it looks like it's going to happen. And our water utility, the DEP, Department of Environment Protection, that's what it's called, has been holding public hearings about it and meetings and planning meetings and so forth. So I'm going to read this article and share it. And again, I thank you so much. I learned a lot. So I hope we do this again for your next book.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for highlighting Tibbetts Brook. I look forward to learning more about that.
Terrific. Great.
All right.
Be in touch. Thanks,
Take care.
Erica. You too.
Bye.
Bye.